This is kind of a strange situation for me because being here in DIE, which is my home base, I'm going to give this presentation in English. Originally I had planned to do it in Spanish, but I was asked specifically to change languages, which of course caused all kinds of trans-language crisis in my mind last night, trying to move quickly from one to the other. But since I really live in I have a bilingual mind and existence, and I tend to move back and forth between languages constantly, I'm hoping it's not going to be a problem. And for the Spanish-speaking audience, I will try to throw in a few interesting comments for you specifically, and try and make this as fluent as possible. So we'll see. Before I begin, I would like to thank some very important people. First, my colleague and dear friend Kalman, who invited me in to give this talk and gave me this opportunity to present some of the research I've been doing. And it was a little bit of mental gymnastics because I don't usually talk to high ed crowds, so I had to think a little bit harder about how to think. I had to think about the relevance of what I do in some very everyday type contexts for higher education and all that goes along with that. But I'd also like to thank two very important people. One is Claudia Patricia Valdivia Sanchez, who's my student. She's sitting right over there, who is a very important part of the research I'm going to present, and who has the very difficult task of keeping me organized. So I'm extremely grateful to her. And I want to thank my colleague Rene Montero, who might be watching us from Colombia, because he was also my student, and he graduated just about a year ago, and he was extremely helpful and collaborative in helping me find some very interesting examples from his dissertation, which in fact was a higher ed context. So that helped me, and he helped me bridge these everyday and higher ed contexts. So I want to share with you something that happened to me when I was getting ready to put together my talk for this morning. And what happened is that the first thing I did when I had sort of the parts together, but I was thinking about how to sew all the seams. As I was preparing, I went back and read the call for papers, and I was a little bit stumped by the very first line. The first line says, "The transition to digital society implies a huge change in economic, social, and cultural lives of nations." And I kept getting stuck. I read the sentence and I stopped, and I read the sentence and I stopped, and I kept going back. And I wasn't real sure what it was that was making me uncomfortable as a reader. And so I went and I looked at the Spanish, and it says, "La transición a la sociedad digital implica inmenso cambio en la vida económica, social y cultural de las naciones." And I realized that what I was getting thrown by was the use of a definite article, the digital society. And I also noticed that it was also in the Spanish version, so I came to the conclusion that it wasn't a translation thing or a stylistic thing, that it was really quite intentional. And I was quite relieved yesterday when Inés also started out talking about some grammatical categories. She was concerned with verbs and nouns and knowledge as a noun, as a verb, and some of the delicacies of Spanish verbs that we can use both as nouns and as actions and as things. And so it's like there's a way to say to knowledge. Bad translation, but that's basically the idea. So I was quite taken by the fact that she started also with a discussion of how do we say things, because that's a lot of what we do in academia, isn't it? We think very hard about how we say things, how we represent them, what they mean, what the intentions are behind them, some of the things that go on between the lines and the underlying assumptions. So I began to think about, well, what is the digital society? What do we mean by the digital society? And I asked myself, and these are not just rhetorical questions, I really was quite thrown for a few minutes, and so I was asking myself things like, what is a digital society? What does it look like? How does it work? And who participates? And I did what anybody would do in our position. I Googled it to see what other people had to say. And I came up with several, a whole bunch of definitions came up. Some talked about a digital society, others talked about the digital society, but all of them were in the singular. It was very interesting to me that nobody is using the plural. And I know this is quite small, I don't know if you can actually read it, so I thought I would quickly go through what some of these definitions are. And I chose these, some might call it, I chose these intentionally because they're very different kinds of organizations. So there's the Association of Universities in the Netherlands. There's a definition here from the RAND Corporation, which is a private sort of research and marketing group whose audience is policymakers and those kind of folks. A publication for higher education that most of you are probably familiar with, and La Fundación Internacional Sesgo, which is something I just found, but they self-define as a cultural organization to discuss cultural issues in Mexico and across America, Latin America, and the rest of the world. So it's interesting how they talk about, for example, the digital society of the universities in the Netherlands. They talk about how we communicate, socialize, work, and participate in politics have all been changed by digital technologies, and the promises that the digital has for us in terms of tremendous benefits, and this is textual, tremendous benefits for better health, more efficient mobility, efficient energy use, and so on. And the RAND Corporation talks about how compressed into 2 decades there has been a great deal of change in our society, and the changes take place across multiple domains and situations. They talk about workplace, home, local community, how we buy things, purchasing goods, travel, how we travel, and different types of social interactions. And the publication, the Times Higher Education, this is more in line with what was in the call here, talking about how digital innovation, that's a very important word, innovation shapes our society, our economy, our culture, our lifestyle, and the way that it can potentially is another important word, impact and advance all aspects. But the assumption is that it will advance all aspects of our society. And this, and there's a call here for the need for rigorous research. And the last one, which I find extremely interesting, is that it says that the reality of the new digital world, again, in the singular and in the definite, is that human beings of today have completely changed their forms of communication in accordance with the internet. Fashion, la moda, fashion, and online trends. And there's a little snippet here about how we use hashtags and emoticons and so on. So there's sort of an assumption here with the use of this definite article that I'm still not happy about, where we see it is assumed that we all know what the digital society is. It's a known entity. It's defined for all those involved in the conversation. So here's my attempt to summarize for you some of the main points of these 4 definitions. And first of all, digital in the world, which is my words, not theirs, they cover, these 4 definitions cover a large number of social domains. So I'm not going to read them all, but you heard them when we were talking about, when I was going through the definitions of how it's everything from the arts, we could have added sports here, but it wasn't in the definitions, the arts to healthcare, to public services and so on. And at the same time, there's an idea that digital technologies are omnipresent, and they're where we are and what we do. And they bring about complete changes in the way we communicate, we socialize and work, and they are attached to or linked in some way with the idea of benefits. Nobody's talking about risk here, or perhaps costs, but they're the importance of the benefits for healthcare, mobility, and energy consumption are clearly stated. And of course, the idea that it's an impact on society, economy, culture, and lifestyle. So I think there are some important underlying ideas here, assumptions about who we are and how we live, and who those who participate in the digital society are and how they live. And that could be a they or a we. To begin with, there's an idea of moving in one direction, where we are on a single track and moving towards some kind of state of maturity or development. There's also notions of growth, evolution, favorable change, progress. That this is something that is necessarily moving us from towards a better, I guess what could be considered desirable transformations. And of course, the idea that technology the use of technology is for relieving humankind from hard work and labor and tasks. It's to make things easier for us. These are all assumptions underlying here, and they carry benefits. So when you look at, you read these kinds of definitions and assumptions in this way, it raises an issue for me, and not just for me, for several scholars. The one I'm going to cite here is Jackson. But it raises the issue of what is our starting point for thinking through the nature, use, and effects of digital technology? And I think this is an important question. And I think it's an important question because in how we frame what we do and how we think about things will influence clearly how we, what we are able to see and what we are able to appreciate. So I want to put forward this question and think about some of the assumptions that I just talked about, and how can we make room, how from this notion of framework of progress and advancement, do we account for situations like this? Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this case, no sé si conozcan este caso, fue muy famoso en las redes sociales. It first was a case where a young man from a town or a city, I guess it's a town called Kumasi, which is about 250 miles from Accra in Ghana. His name is Richard Appiah Alesto. He made a post on Facebook. I don't know if any of you saw this. A post on Facebook where he put up these pictures and some videos of how he teaches technology in this small school. It's a junior high school, secundaria. And his posting became viral, and it went to YouTube, and eventually it was picked up by BBC, by CNN, by the National Public Radio, and a lot of just news agencies. And what he tells in his post is that he has to teach technology in the school, but there's no computers. I'm not sure there's light. I tried to find out if there was electricity, and I wasn't successful, but there are no computers at all. And the reason he teaches this, he's the informatics teacher, is because his students who are in 9th grade, in el último año de secundaria, they have to take a test to get into the next level of education, and to medio superior, and to get into high school. And one of the parts of the test is on technology. And they have to be able to answer questions, have at least a declarative knowledge of how technology and using a computer works. So if you look at the picture on the far side, what he has done is he has drawn a picture of software. It's Microsoft Word. And what he has done is he tells them how to what each thing is called and how they work and what you use it for. And because the classes change from hour to hour, when the next teacher comes in, they erase his drawing. So every day he has to come in and draw again this representation of what using Word looks like. So how do we account for something like this? I think that's a fair question, because most of what we know, or a lot of what we know about technologies, digital technologies, and how they're used, and how they're articulated to the social world is through research that is done in what Berengent, a digital anthropologist, refers to as the privileged centers, cutting-edge technology, or hip informational avant-garde. I like the hip informational avant-garde part. And he says that our understanding and knowledge would benefit a great deal from looking at diverse digital worlds. And he talks about the importance of understanding the use of digital technologies, in the plural, in the less than optimal circumstances of what he calls the awkwardly connected. Much of what is said and how using technology is represented based on ideal situation. It's like a lot of things, a lot of policy. Policy often depends on certain elements, certain conditions being in place, and then projections are made about what might be accomplished. Well, it's sort of the same thing here. There's a lot of assumptions about optimal and ideal conditions. And so he talks about the world, the need to understand that which is less than optimal, what he calls the awkwardly connected. And that would mean things like using makeshift computers, working in constricted spaces with restricted access to know-how, and without necessarily ample financial resources. So it's a call for to move from predictable world to much more unpredictable worlds, and to be sensitive to the eventualities and the chance events that happen through life when one is using this kind of technology, or when one is doing anything, basically. So going back to the same question, the idea is to extend it, to amplify it, and to ask what is the starting point for thinking through the nature, the use, and the effects of digital technology. And are we thinking of a world of novelty, growth, invention, favorable change and progress? Or are we thinking of a world of eventuality, chance events, breakdown, erosion, and repair, where these things are the norm and not the exception? And is there something in between? Do we have situations where both of these things can be present? So I wanted to mention briefly that over the last couple years in my research group, in LETS, it's called, Laboratorio de Educación, Tecnología y Sociedad, we've been doing a series of studies about different situations every day, in school and out of school, though we don't like to talk about in school and out of school because then it seems like in school is the basic context and out of school is everything else. So we talk about different social domains, taking the concept of domains from social linguistics. And we have studies on kids living in a marginal area, trying to stay connected and up to date and online. The study of classrooms and teachers trying to incorporate and understand how to relate long-standing curriculum and institutional demands to the use of technology, which is now a new demand. We have the study on, some of these are dissertations, some of this is my own work or my work with the rest of the group. We have studies on citizen science and the presence of technologies in citizen science, including writing technologies and writing itself. And the current study that we're doing now, that Patricia and I are working on, is on the precariously connected, and we're working in Tláhuac, which is about 45 minutes from here and is considered to be a marginalized area here in Mexico City. And the work that we are doing is, we consider it marginalized because it has poor local infrastructure. Even the electricity, being in Mexico City, the electricity is unstable. For example, people complained about if the business next to theirs has a high use of electricity, then they can't use their computers. So one of the people the participants in our study who uses computers constantly as part of her work, across the street is a laundromat, dry cleaners. And in the afternoon when they put their machines on, there's not enough voltage for the computers to run. So that's why we refer to unstable electricity and at the same time, it's unreliable connectivity. There is a predominance of secondhand equipment, old devices, locally assembled computers, bootleg software, not using the main licensed kinds of software, but pirated or bootlegged software. It's basically a low-income area. It is one of the areas in the city with the lowest formal education attainment. These are all indicators that are used to talk about marginality. The main activity is still agriculture. It's distant from downtown. It's geographically large, and so we consider that it is what Berenger referred to when he talked about the less optimal and the precariously connected. And you're going to see why that notion of less optimal and precariously connected gets extended throughout this talk. So from this study, I was trying to think of some of the findings that we have and how they might be useful for thinking about using technology, digital technologies in higher education types of situations, which are multiple, and where the uses are diverse. So it's for collaboration, it's for research itself. The use of digital technologies is also an object of study. It's part of our teaching. There's things that we expect our students to be able to do. And so I came up with some caveats. So when we think of the digital, or a-digital, or I would like to say digitalities in the plural, here are some things that we want to keep in mind, which I'm calling caveats, that might help us have a more nuanced approach to understanding the digital. So the first one is that the digital is in social worlds, and social worlds are in the digital. And what I mean by that is that what we do when we talk about technology, we can talk about it in isolation as a thing in itself, but when we start to look at it in use, all kinds of things get messy, and our notion of how digital works begins to fray. And here's a couple of quotes that technology is both embeds and is embedded in social practices, identity, norms, conventions, discourse, instruments, and institutions. And I like this quote because in one very quick sentence, it touches on many complex and complicated aspects of technology use. The next notion that I think is important, and it goes back to this idea of the ideal and this ideologicalized notion of digital technologies, and that is that the benefits are presented as unbound while the risks are framed as manageable. And sometimes the risks are manageable and sometimes they're not, and I would say also not just risks, but some of the unplanned and life circumstances have an impact on the way that the digital and digital possibilities get used. So the question is, what world are we talking about when we talk about the digital world? This is the notion, this is a representation which is the shiny, glossy version of technology. So you see in the figure this woman standing with her computer, and she has up on the screen, it looks like she's collaborating with somebody, and there is data that is represented, both numerical and text, and in text. And this is sort of the prototype of what we think of, or what we're presented with in movies and in commercials and on Google and in research of what it is that is digital and how it looks. So is it the shiny, glossy world, or is it the rough and tumble world of the everyday? Somebody who is using a computer in a situation that is not really thought of as a place where a computer might be used. And this is a picture, and here collaboration looks very different, doesn't it? In the first picture, collaboration is on screen, and this is one of those representations that's very ephemeral. We don't know if this is being projected over glass or a big screen, but in the next one we have no doubt that the collaboration is one-on-one, and it's mediated by this computer that they're both looking at. And the reason this computer is on the street is because this man is an informal worker. He is a photographer outside the Registro Civil, the local courthouse in Tláhuac, where people take their babies to get a birth certificate, or they go to get married, and people want pictures on the spot. For example, one of the most requested pictures is the moment that the judge or the employee takes the baby's thumb and puts it in the ink and then puts it on the paper that is their physical birth certificate. Everybody seems to want a photograph of that moment of when their baby gets a name and a last name and becomes a person in the official sense. And so he works outside, and he has many arrangements with the local bureaucrats and authorities that allow him to wander in and out with his camera, and he runs outside and he reproduces the pictures and sells them to people as they come out the door. So there's a lot of things going on, but in this particular picture, these two people are looking at some photographs together and making a decision about which ones to print. And also there's another aspect. There's this sterile showroom of the latest and most modern, and you gotta have it devices and how they're presented and how they're sold. And the space, but the thing that impresses me the most about this picture, which I pulled offline, is that the space is immaculate. There's nothing out of place, there's no papers on the ground. Everything seems to be perfectly presented, even the angle that the computers have been photographed. But then there's this. This is another view of digital worlds, and this is a market where most of what is being sold is either secondhand, it could be bootlegged or pirated kinds of softwares. Its origin could be dubious. We don't know what the origin of some of these secondhand things are. Are they stolen? Were they hijacked? And so we have a very different approach and a very different proximity to digital objects through these different marketplaces. And then, of course, there's the issue of knowledge circulation and the ways teaching and learning happen. And so one way to think of it might be the tech lab, which was very popular and is still very popular in many schools, not all, but many schools, where the students are set up in these lines and lines of computers, and the concept is one student to one machine, and this is where the class takes place. But there's others too. There's our friend from before who is teaching technology without the digital technologies. The technology he has is a chalkboard and the ability to write and draw. So there's those kind of representational technologies. Or there's also Moodle, which is I would say, representative in some way of the electronic classroom, the digital classroom, which is based or has many characteristics that we can trace back to the physical one. So my point here is that when we talk about digital worlds, we need to be very clear and think about what it is that we have in these worlds, what they have in common. They're not completely divorced, but at the same time, what are the distinctive characteristics that makes them be the specific situated moments and places for people that they are. So here's another example. I want to take a minute. I'm going to try and show you a little clip of a video, but I think this is very important because part of this notion of digital technologies is the idea of inventiveness and design and continual improvement, and these are desktop computers, and these computers are built and designed based on a series of assumptions about where we're going to set them up, how we're going to set them up, how we're going to be positioned in front of them, and so on. And it's assumed that they'll be on a tabletop. You can see all of these pictures. They're on tabletops, and all of the equipment is carefully placed around the screen, and there's very few wires available. If you see, there's almost no wires, because wires are not very aesthetic. I personally don't care for them. But then again, there is this situation. This is it's now to my left. On the left-hand side is Senor Francisco's computer again. He works on the street, and he has come up with many ways of adapting a computer that was originally designed to be on a tabletop, to be on a curbside, on a concrete slab, and on the top, he's got his computer on the top of the box. And there's two things I want to point out here. One is that if you look closely on the side of his printer is a box of ink. This is before Epson had come out with their model where you could refill. And this is these are bootlegged wells of ink that somebody began to design, and you could buy them in the Plaza de la Computación. There's a market downtown that has only computational and technology kind of stuff, and somebody had come up with this design, and you could attach it to the outside, and there was a way to wire it into the place where ink was supposed to go, and you could fill the wells, and of course with ink that was also produced on the sly, because the cost of ink for these printers was so high that it wasn't feasible. So there's an example of redesign. But I want to show you another example. I have a little video clip of how this working on the street has led Señor Francisco to appropriate and adapt what he does with technology and how he uses it. All right. Alt, okay. See, I told you. No. This is not a generation thing. I don't know this computer. ¿Cuál es? Alt, ¿qué? No, you me dijiste shift, no era shift, era flecha. Okay. Okay, so I want you to, I'm going to have to stand up for this. I want you to think about what this looks like on the street. So there's a slab of cement, and on the slab of cement is a screen and the computer itself, and to the side, sitting on a box, is all of the printing stuff. And so the question is that if you were at a table, if your computer is at a table, then you have your mouse on the table, and you use the table as where you move the mouse back and forth to be able to make changes. So here, in this particular clip, I want you to look very carefully at how he has solved the problem of having no table to use his mouse. We took the sound off on purpose because it was part of the interview, and while we were interviewing, he was working. So can you see? ¿Ya pueden ver dónde está haciendo lo del mouse? Sobre su cuerpo. And apparently, I was talking to some other researchers who were doing something similar in another place, and apparently this is quite common. And the whole thing about, you know, you can imagine the screen, and he's trying to get to the right place, and so he has to get up under his camera. So this gives you an idea of some of the adaptation. And there are, and the idea here being that in these small, minute, tactical changes in the way computers are used, we have evidence of reinventiveness, of redesign, and of processes of appropriation of this equipment into situations that it was really not meant for. The computer was not designed to use on a street curb. No, wrong one. So, this is the ink thing. I kind of got ahead of myself, but here you can see much better the ink wells that I was talking about earlier, where here you can see the computer, you can see the context that he's actually in, all the connections, whereas on the desktop representation, you don't see any wires or how things are plugged in. Here, everything is visible and available, and of course, how the ink is attached to the outside and routed into the computer to be on the printer. So here's number 2. This is my second caveat, and the point I want to make here, if I can find my notes. The point I want to make here is that not everything about these technologies are new. So it's interesting to think, if you look back at some of the policy from the 60s, for example, on literacy, much of what was said about literacy is also said now about digital technologies. that if in the 60s, the idea was that if everybody just knew how to read and write, they would be able to get the jobs they needed, and it would push international development, and it would help societies move along this one clear path towards what that time was modernity, which was basically a type of industrialization. Some things very similar have been said about the digital. And there's a researcher at the University of California in Irvine. His name is, I think it's Steve Warshauer. And he analyzes with quite detail the similarities between literacy and literacy ideologies and literacy policies, and he compares them to the digital. And he has noted that, to begin with, both of these technologies are closely connected to advances in human communication and the production of knowledge and the way knowledge is circulated. They also both involve a series of cultural artifacts that are socially valued and are connected to creating and distributing information, cultural products, and approaches to and knowledge in general. Also, both of them have been billed, have been promoted as revolutionizing in some way, in their moment, revolutionizing human communication, revolutionizing knowledge, revolutionizing storage and archives of information. And there's an interesting anecdote. I've been trying to find it again, but I haven't been able to put my hands on it. There's an anecdote by Daniel Webster that's reported that Daniel Webster in 1820 received a letter from Europe and was amazed at the speed of human communication, that it only took 1 month to receive news from the old world to the new world, and that it was the height of efficient and rapid interaction between the two continents, and he couldn't imagine how it could get any better. It just goes to show how context all of this is, how contextualized it is, and how each advance is heralded as the final and most efficient and surprising one. Now, Warshauer also points out that the common definition of access to both literacy and to the digital technologies has to do with possession. One, in the case of literacy, it's the ability, somewhat mechanical, to be able to possess the code. And in the case of the digital technologies, it's more centered on what artifacts do you have, what artifacts do you own. And that's true of literacy also. Did you have a typewriter? Did you have pen and paper? Did you have a recording device so that you could transcribe? All of these objects are related to, in some way, being part of and participating in literate and digital worlds. But it's important not to ignore the fact that both using digital technologies and and literacy are social practices. And though they're often thought of as individual habits or abilities, they are in fact socially and historically organized activities that are highly situated, and their meaning and their usefulness depends greatly on the context where they're found. So there's a third caveat that I think is important. So in the last one, the idea was that keep in mind that not everything is new, and so there'll be continuities, and there'll be extensions of things that we were familiar with before, and there will, of course, be novel things as well, but we want to keep an eye on the nuances of what things are not completely new, and how what is new is related to that which we were familiar with before. So the next caveat has to do with unplanned consequences. And what I mean by that is that things don't always work the way we expect them to. Life is full of unplanned events, and these all have to be, in some way, dealt with. And often the intended actions and policies have unintended consequences and impact. So this is One of the things that we've been looking at, and I never thought I would be so interested in trámites. I never thought red tape could be so interesting to me. But it keeps coming up in these everyday kinds of digital technology contexts. So this is the copy of a light contract. It's a contract I made in 1973. And the way I made it was I went to the electricity office and I got in line and I stood there. And when I got to the desk, the person who was in charge, he had this form and he would ask me what they needed to know and fill it in. And if there was a question, he had the authority to make the decision on how to solve it. That's a very simplified version, but that's basically how it goes. And so the whole thing about doing, tener que hacer trámites en persona and now being able to do them, what is said to be from the comfort of your home, without having to stand in line, unless of course things don't work. So I have a very nice example of course, you can still go to the power company and get in line and do make your contract or pay your bill, but there's a huge campaign to do it online. And the idea of going paperless has many implications and ramifications to it, but there is a way to do this online without actually having to go now. And so the idea is that you get onto the power utilities page and you fill out a form, and then they send you a PDF of your bill and you download the bill and you pay it, or you can pay it right online and you're done. And it was easy and fast and slick, and it only took you a few minutes. Unless, of course, something doesn't work. So this is a case that we observed, Patricia and I observed in one of these little, we don't know what to call them because they used to be called cyber cafes, but there's no more coffee, so it's really just a little stationary store with a bunch of computers in it. So a person shows up and says that she wants to pay her bill, and could the person who, the customer asked the person running the little shop to please download and print out her bill so she can go pay it. Well, they get into line, they start to fill out the form, they get to the end, they go through all of the steps, they put in her name, they put in the contract, they put in all the things that they're supposed to put in, and when she says send, it says no. There's something there that they didn't like. So they tried it again, and they weren't able to get it to download. So when they're going back and forth, she says, well, what if we put in a certain code that came in on the bill? And the attendant at the shop said, okay, and so the person says, the customer says, I have an image of my bill. Because it turns out she'd tried to do this before, and somebody had sent her via WhatsApp a copy of her bill. Well, that means that this wasn't the first time she was having problems, and so she went to, so the person in the store says, you have an image? Is it in your phone? She says, yes. And she literally snatches the phone from the customer and says, okay, what's your password? She starts opening up WhatsApp, and she gets into WhatsApp. She asks the customer, what is your account? What is your password? She goes straight into the person's account, and she finds the image, and instead of taking the number off the bill, what she does is she just prints it straight from the image that was already available. This is just the data. We don't have time to get into the data, but it shows how the interaction went. So my point here is that there was a breakdown here. There was a breakdown in the procedure, and it wasn't the first one, and this person who was supposed to be able to quickly and slickly be able to download and then pay her bill, it turned out that she had to ask for help from more than one person, and these are the kind of mediators that we are finding in our research of all different types, people who are bridging between the pages that don't work, the procedures, the web pages that are too full, the procedures that don't, for some reason, don't make life easier, and people who are trying to do what they're supposed to do, which in this case is pay a bill. So, okay. So I have a bunch of examples now. I'm going to have to choose one or two from this higher ed project that I told you about, where I want to look at these three caveats, that the social world is in the digital and the digital is in the social world. that not everything is new, and that there are unintended consequences to the policies and practices that we see emerging now. So quickly, there were a lot of sites, of quotes from students that Renee helped me pull together, and they cover a whole array of situations where students are complaining or talking about why they couldn't participate in the online collaborative activities that were assigned to them through Moodle on an online bachelor's program. But what I want to point out is that they affect not having access to connectivity, or their computers not being compatible, or not, or having to go to work, because these are students who are doing these open schedule kinds of study programs. All of these things interfere with an idealized idea of what studying online looks like. And so it affects their ability to participate. It affects the development of the activities according to the way they're planned, and the way they're supposed to look, and the way people are supposed to collaborate, and that the world is seeping into the digital in this case. So I'm going to skip these. And this one I think is particularly interesting. I have a series of 3 quotes here, which I will summarize quickly, between Guillermo and a teacher. Guillermo has sent in his assignment. It's a draft, and the teacher writes back and says that he needs to be careful because she realized that much of what he had sent had been taken from other internet pages, and that in fact it's very important for him to do it in his own words, hacerlo en tus propias palabras, which is an instruction that we have been giving with and without technology, these kind of technologies, for a very long time. And the point, she said, was that first, that it was a way to observe his learning process, but also, and she sort of underplays this in this communication, we want to be careful about plagiarism. So the student answers back, and he says, yeah, except that I didn't copy, I didn't plagiarize, because if you look carefully, I included things from other sources, and I combined them, and so I'm not plagiarizing at all. And some of the things, there's not much you can do with it because they're definitions. That's the essence of what it says here. And it's interesting, this is extremely interesting to me because plagiarism has become such a big topic now, the whole idea of what is it and who understands it to be what, and when copying has been such an important school-type practice, at what point is the copying acceptable, when is it not acceptable? All of those things are seeping in here. And the teacher comes back, and this time she has much stronger language for him, and she says, I'm just giving you a fair warning that plagiarism is not acceptable, and we have a strict ethical, rules about this, and I just want you to be careful and know that I'm making note. So that's another example of where these caveats come into play, that how notions and access to understandings, and not just to the technology itself is insufficient to explain what's going on here. And this last example is very interesting because one of the assignments they were given was to draw a cell. Now, there's not a lot you can invent about a cell. The cells have representations, they have a nucleus, they have a cytoplasm, and they all have these little organelles that have names, and the standard way of representing that is to draw a line from the organelle to outside the cell and to put the name there. So they had the assignment of drawing a cell and putting it up online. And the idea was to draw it freehand, or a mano alzada. And to draw it freehand, there's some confusion here between these 2 students about how she should do that. Because the first student sent in her drawing, and her classmate, all the classmates are supposed to give their opinion and some critique. One classmate writes back and says, yes, you did it, but it wasn't done properly because you did it on the computer and it has to be a mano alzada. And so she says, I did it in Paint. So she actually did draw it, but she mediated it with the software. So here you can compare. The ones at the top are the ones that she did in Paint, and the ones on the bottom are the ones she did by hand and photographed and sent in. And you can see that in both cases they are not the standard reproductions, though the ones that are done by hand are actually quite more detailed, and she had copied from a page in internet. And I think this plays to the comment that Inez made yesterday about what is the difference between taking a photograph of something or going through the action of actually having to reproduce it in your notebook. So the issue here is, what do we mean by drawing freehand? And this is just a copy of a Google page where paint is defined as dibujo a mano alzada. It's actually a software that is for you to draw freestyle, but using a digital technology. So just to close, my main reflection here is about the complexities and the complicatedness of digital technologies and how they are being incorporated into our world, and the many chance events and contingencias that we need to take into place. Things break. Things don't always go the way you expect them to. There are material and social barriers that are to access goods, knowledge, and know-how. There's continuities and discontinuities, and this collection, and we could go on, but this basic collection of observations is extremely important when we try to promote the use of technology in higher education and classroom situations, when we observe how it's used in and out of academic situations, and when we think about what we mean by the digital society. Gracias.